The lash of viciously wicked lust, one of the homunculi from Full Metal Alchemist, beautiful and deadly. Her main means of weaponry are the ultimate spear, the ability to turn her fingers into extendable blades or claws that can cut through anything. Though she canonically strikes with her right hand, I opted to create for my left to still give me the ability to function. Starting with a trip to Home Depot, I knew the claws might have some weight to them, so I wanted to get magnets and washers to sew inside of the gloves. Though it wasn't very effective for this project, that method might still prove useful for other builds. Next, I needed to map out how this would work. I started with making a pattern of my fingertips to serve as the base. The usual method of self-patterning for cosplayers is to wrap said body part in plastic wrap and then use duct tape. For this, I put on 2 latex gloves, then used masking tape to wrap where I wanted the fingertips to be. The reason for the 2 gloves, one for the tape to adhere to, and one for the right level of thickness when I wrap the tape, since the claws are going to be placed on top of gloves, sort of like the Halloween witch fingers. After that, I used a metallic Sharpie to label each finger as well as make seam marks, then cut the glove off. Once that was complete, I then cut each fingertip out entirely and got rid of as much excess latex as I could. The shape of my pattern would become a cylinder tube base with a circle for the top of each fingertip. Then once the pieces were cut out, it was time to transfer the pattern to paper to ensure the lines are cleaned up and that everything is more concise. From there, it was easy. Just place the homemade pattern on top of the paper and trace around it. Using a pencil to do this allows for me to straighten lines up that may have been a little bumpy from small gaps in the tape or lines that didn't lay correctly because of the 2 latex gloves. Again, I made sure to label which finger was what. Though my ring finger and pointer finger are similar in size and width, my thumb is the largest and my pinky is the smallest, and clearly I didn't want to mix them up. Off camera, I cut out those paper patterns and then transferred them to the white Worbla. For this project, the color differences in the Worbla aren't really relevant, I just had a lot of leftovers on hand. I used a Sharpie marker to do the drawing this time, and then, off camera again, I used an X-Acto knife to cut them out. Separately, I got 2 pieces of paper, taped them together long ways, and then began to sketch out the shape that I wanted for the claws. Previously, I used a measuring tape to see about visually how long I wanted them to be, measuring from my middle finger and then going to the longest point. Based upon that measurement, I then sketched out the other fingers, one for the pinky, one for the thumb. The shape of the middle finger was what I wanted the ring and pointer fingers to be, just in a slightly shorter length. I also referenced the fingertip patterns for width. It required a little bit of visualizing, shaping, and erasing to get what I wanted, but eventually it all came together. With the claw patterns finalized, it was now time to cut out those pieces and transfer them to foam. I've amassed a big foam collection and scrap collection through the years, so I just used a leftover piece of 10mm foam that I had on hand. I've made foam hands before for my obsidian cosplay, but that was 2 pieces of 6 and 8mm foam sandwiched together. These claws would eventually come together to a taper point, so I didn't want them to be too thick right out of the gate, especially since a lot of shaping would be necessary. After the patterns were transferred, I used a box cutter to cut the foam pieces out. I like box cutters for thicker foam cuts since the blade is longer and you can usually get a smoother and more even cut on one single attempt. With the fingers now cut, it was time to get rid of those sharp edges and shape everything. I used my Dremel for this, with the basic rotary attachment. Though it's not always optimal to do your sanding and Dremel work in the house, my garage doesn't have good lighting, and I often work very late at night, so I can't exactly go outside, but know that I am safe and got everything cleaned up afterwards. When doing your Dremel work, there is an arrow that's etched into the side of the tool to let you know what direction you need to move it. It's always best to move the tool out of a corner instead of going into it. And with the sharp points for the claws, I would move the Dremel towards the sharp point instead of away from it. Each finger took about 15 minutes to shape to the point that I wanted, smoothing out the boxy shape and forming it to a more menacing appearance. Finally, with my heat gun, I sealed the foam to be prepped for PlastiDip. Save for the red color of this foam, this actually turned out very cool. Then it was time to get the fingertips together. There isn't an inherently 100% safe way to do this, so please be careful. I used my heat gun to prime the Worbla tips and then went to mold it around each respective finger. First, I would form the cylinder shape and then smooth the circle tip down to seal everything together. You can see where it was a smidge too hot for me a time or two, but I did let the Worbla cool enough to where I could still manipulate it without burning myself. Next, I went to glue the magnets to the tips. Again, this was a great idea in concept, but did not execute well when I tried to add the washers while sewing. Maybe smaller metal pieces would have worked in the end. I used contact cement to fuse the tips to the magnets and the magnets to the foam claws. It's really cool to see this come to life. Next, it was time to wrap everything in black Worbla. Prior to this, I used foam clay to insulate the connection points between the fingertips and the foam claws, making it smoother and not as many bumps or dips once it's wrapped in the Worbla. The sandwich method calls for using 2 pieces of Worbla to put on the top and bottom of your item. But since I was limited on supply, I opted just to do one larger piece and wrapped it around to make a single seam. As always, using the heat gun to prep the Worbla for molding. Then once it was primed, I put one of the claws on and began to wrap the Worbla around it, bringing the edges together on the backside. This required a lot of pinching, smoothing, heating, reheating, and manipulation to get the appearance just right, especially for those fine tapered tips of the claws. Once the seams were where I wanted them, it was time to cut away the excess, and even that had to be done in phases. After giving them that slight bend and deadly curve with the heat gun, we had some amazing claws. Even before the paint, they are menacing. Off camera, I sanded down the seams, and then it was time for the star of the show and the sponsor of this video, PlastiDip. I used their microfiber towel to clean off any last remaining debris, and then I used 2 coats of the glossy PlastiDip to prime. Off camera, I used 2 coats of high gloss spray paint and 2 coats of a gloss top coat to finish them. I wanted the high shine of the PlastiDip and the paint to match the glossy pleather look that I used for Lust's gloves. The gloves I finished sewing while at my event, and that's where I found that the metal washer idea wasn't the best, so I just cut them out entirely, especially since the claws fit perfectly without them. But you have to admit, these are absolutely phenomenal, and one of the most fearsome props that I have ever made. This cosplay was so much fun to create, and I'm so grateful to PlastiDip for sponsoring my work. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.